Asking blue pill, red pill, corporate press, I've had my fill. I'm just a simple chap, believing in my own will. Wet fire, math evil, scheming, this is no drill. Haters masking boosted, but still with no chill. Need to come and take it if you wanna mess with my hill. We've been 3D printing, setting ready for that ghost kill.
Hello, Canada, and welcome back to another episode of the Maple Pill. As always, I'm your host, Matt McKeever, and we've got a full course of pills to swallow tonight. Lots of different stories to cover. Two of the headline stories that you guys probably saw in the thumbnail today is talking about the Emergencies Act Inquiry, which has just been announced. We're going to do a quick little summary on that, and then also talking about the Rolling Thunder Convoy. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on both those topics as well. There's a lot of stories we're not going to cover today. Yesterday, we had the special episode where we did a specific deep dive on the David Fissman and his mathematical modeling. And it was a weekend, so I feel like there's a lot of stories to catch up on. So we're not going to dive too deep into Elon Musk buying Twitter, although that is really interesting. And I can't help but feel like it's a net benefit. Now, how much of a benefit we'll see, but certainly, anecdotally speaking, it sounds like a lot of previous thought criminals on Twitter are receiving huge boosts to their followings. You guys have likely seen it if you're active on Twitter yourselves. So that's interesting. And certainly there's a lot of other things going on just in the culture wars in general. But anyways, we've got a lot to cover tonight, so I'm going to jump into it. As always, I want to hear what stories you guys are following in the comments section, and give me your hot takes on everything we cover tonight as well in the comments. But let's jump into it. I think I've got my hotkeys fixed, so fingers crossed my Zoom button and everything else works. So the first thing I want to talk to you guys about is the Emergencies Act Inquiry. So we've got a handful of different stories here, and links to this story as well as all the other stories we're going to cover tonight in the video description down below. But Trudeau announces Emergencies Act Inquiry headed by Justice Paul Rouleau can have people testify in public and demand the government provide documents. So a couple things that are interesting is just the way arguably mainstream media has chosen to frame this, right? It often is framed essentially as like Justin Trudeau's, proactively wanting to launch this Emergencies Act Inquiry. Now, I think any of us that have been paying attention understand that this is actually just law, right? And I believe the last day was either that, like, he had 60 days, right, since the invoking of it. And I believe that it was either the 24th or the 25th was the last day where they had to announce it. So again, this wasn't particularly proactive. This is something they're forced to do by law, but it is good that at least, they're going to follow this law. So Ottawa, an Ontario appeal court judge, will oversee an inquiry into the government's use of the Emergencies Act with the power to compel testimony and demand documents on why the Liberals invoked the Act for the first time in Canada's history. Now, in regards to just a couple things about this, so he said the government stands by its decision to invoke the Act and welcomes the scrutiny. I believe this is in regards to Mendocino. It was a necessary decision. It was a responsible decision. It was the right thing to do. And we are certainly looking forward to cooperating with Justice Rouleau. Now, I think there's a lot of different things to unpack here in regards to both how mainstream media is framing this, as well as just like whether this is actually going to amount to anything. A lot of critics of Justin Trudeau are pointing out the fact that it really appears the primary focus of this inquiry is how the situation arose and not whether it was appropriate for the government to invoke the Emergencies Act. And obviously that's kind of an important distinction, wouldn't you agree? So let's jump over to a couple other highlights here. So government calls inquiry to use of Emergencies Act. That's from National News Watch. And on Monday evening, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association said the government's comments fell short by making it clear they want the inquiry to look into the actions of the protesters. But the requirement to call an inquiry was put into the Emergencies Act to ensure a robust examination of the government's use, said Abby Deschman, director of the CCLA's Criminal Justice Program. The Conservatives echoed that, accusing the government of trying to whitewash the inquiry in a statement of their own. The Liberal government is doing everything in their power to ensure this inquiry is unsubstantial and fails to hold them accountable, the statement said. It just, at this point in time, I think for a lot of Canadians, right, a lot of Canadians that at least maybe supported the truckers or at least were on the fence throughout the protests, the proof of burden to justify this this invoking of the Emergencies Act really comes down to, everyone truly believing this is an impartial inquiry, right? Not to dredge up old history, but reminder, this never actually passed the Senate, right? So they invoked it in Parliament, then rolled it out for essentially like a week, cracked down, froze bank accounts, did all kinds of shenanigans, let's call them. And then essentially right the day that we were expecting to have the Senate vote on it, Trudeau pulls back. And what's interesting, and we covered this live when it was actually occurring in real time, is the fact that, not only did they pull back, but you literally have Liberal senators arguing why this is, paramount that it be passed in the Senate. And then an hour or two later, Justin Trudeau announces it's no longer required and they're, dropping the Emergencies Act. There was a lot of speculation at the time that maybe it wasn't going to pass the Senate, or maybe it wasn't going to pass as cleanly, or, maybe there was going to be more controversy come up throughout those Senate hearings. So essentially, we find ourselves now with this inquiry as the only real line of defense in our democracy to get to the bottom of whether this was justified or not. Those of you that have been following the show for a while, you probably know which side of the aisle I sit on this subject matter. I don't see the justification whatsoever. In fact, arguably, the only thing that the Emergencies Act really allowed the government to do was to freeze bank accounts. And that's a whole ball of wax in of itself, but arguably that, it scared the shit out of a lot of people, and rightfully so. The idea of, the government just waltzing in and freezing your bank accounts willy-nilly. There's all kinds of stories of individuals that, were definitely not domestic terrorists having their accounts frozen, completely peaceful protesters, individuals that just donated. Now, we haven't really seen a lot of information come out after the fact to really get to the bottom of, were some of these claims false? Is the government just kind of sweeping it under the rug? It seems like we're really in limbo here. And again, a truly impartial inquiry would at least potentially allow us to mend a little bit as a society or a community. But I don't think that we're going to get that sort of satisfaction from this inquiry. In fact, I'd be willing to bet dollars to donuts that we won't. Next from the Toronto Sun, don't use inquiry to sweep Emergencies Act failings under the rug. I definitely agree with Brian Lilly on this one. So if you guys want his opinion, check it out. Jumping over to the counter signal, exclusive Trudeau appoints Liberal donor judge to review use of Emergencies Act. And so, first of all, there's a couple of things here to parse out. One, presumably every judge has his own political leanings, and, to the best of my knowledge, judges should be allowed to donate to political parties and things of that nature. They're citizens and all that jazz. But, in a perfect world, I think that, again, we obviously don't live in a perfect world, but in a perfect world, the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, the Liberal Party, would want to appoint someone that, would more than just pass the sniff test in regards to being unbiased, right? Ideally pick someone that maybe was appointed by conservatives, right? A judge, maybe a conservative that even leans a little bit right, in order to really just make sure that, when this is all done, they've got a bow, this is tied with a bow on top, and just they can easily present it to Canadians and be like, look, an unbiased inquiry got to the bottom of this, and this is what was found. Now, I don't think they give a shit about that, right? I think this is just another rubber stamp thing for Trudeau. He knows mainstream media is just going to push out whatever narrative he wants them to push out. So this is all just a formality at this point in time. I do appreciate, Kian from Counter Signal jumping in and looking into, the history of this judge and finding that he's donated consistently for an extended period of time to the Liberal Party. I've also seen a few internet sleuths mentioning, and I haven't fact-checked this, so take it with a heaping grain of salt, but individuals on Twitter were saying that this judge also worked in an article at the same law firm that Justin Trudeau's father did, so where Pierre Trudeau worked. Again, people can inherently have their own backstory to them, and that doesn't inherently make them biased. But at the same time, I think in a perfect world, you probably could have found someone else to be in this position on this inquiry in order to really just to try and actually accomplish something, I guess, rather than just trying to save face. Next from True North, Trudeau calls inquiry into his invocation of the Emergencies Act. And so obviously this one's going to lean a little bit right, that coverage. But, of all the things so far that I've seen, this is probably what concerns me the most, is just it just doesn't feel like the Liberals are serious about wanting to actually understand whether this was an appropriate use or not. So let's jump over to this clip from the Commons. And this is Dane Lloyd. We've shared a couple of videos of Dane Lloyd in the past.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday in response to repeated questions about what documents would be available for the inquiry into the use of the Emergencies Act, the Minister of Emergency Preparedness indicated that documents covered by privilege, such as the advice of the Justice Department to Cabinet, would not be disclosed. The measures used by this government represent the most significant infringement on the civil liberties of Canadians in a generation. Canadians deserve full transparency. Will they disclose their internal analysis that showed they met the threshold for the Emergencies Act and the Justice Department's private opinion, or are they just going to keep hiding this information from Canadians?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Speaker, when the illegal blockades forced borders to close, businesses to shut, workers to be laid off, it was Canadians who paid the biggest price. It was only after we got advice from law enforcement that we invoked the Emergencies Act. It was necessary and it worked. We launched a full-scale independent inquiry appointing Justice Rouleau as commissioner. He has the power to compel witnesses, documents, information, including classified information. Mr. Speaker, we look forward to cooperating with the inquiry to foster transparency, accountability, and incorporating lessons learned so that this never happens again. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Mr. Speaker, Conservatives and Canada Civil Liberties Union were disturbed to see that the Liberals are attempting to control the scope of the inquiry into the Emergencies Act by directing the Commissioner to focus on the actions of the protesters, not the actions of the government. The purpose of this inquiry is not to hold Canadian protesters accountable, but to hold the government accountable when using extraordinary powers. Now, the government has tasked the Commissioner to gather evidence against the protesters, but this begs the question, if the government doesn't already have this evidence, how could they have justified invoking the act in the first place?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I want to encourage my honourable colleague to read the order in council, which specifically says that the judge can look into the conduct of police enforcement. So read the order in council. We want to shine a light on the sober events that led to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. I would encourage my colleague to...
Okay, that's enough of Mendocino. I don't think I can take much more, but it's important to understand how he's framing it there, right? What led to this, right? They're looking at what led to it. They're already starting off with the position that this was justified. So the commissioner of this inquiry needs to figure out, why did we do it? No, you were supposed to have reasons to justify why you did it in the first place, and he's supposed to judge whether that was appropriate or not for you to invoke the Emergencies Act. A bit of a difference there. Actually, a lot of a difference. Actually, an extremely important difference. Next, talking about the Rolling Thunder convoy. I'm curious, have you guys heard much about this? Are you paying attention to it? What's your hot take? I haven't devoted a lot of time or energy to it, but it is interesting just to see how Ottawa as well as mainstream media is approaching this convoy versus the last one. So from CTV News, interim police chief to Rolling Thunder convoy, you will be held accountable. I want to be clear with both organizations and participants, or organizers and participants, you will be held accountable for your actions before, during, and after the events, Bell said. About 500 to 1,000 motorcycles and other vehicles are expected to take part in the event starting on Friday. But unlike the Freedom Convoy protest earlier this year, participants will have to attend on foot rather than driving downtown, as protesters won't be allowed to drive into the downtown core. And so, again, kind of a map of the area they're not going to allow them into if you're interested in understanding that further. Now, again, even just a couple interesting things here. One big question I've got in regards to this is, are we going to hold all protesters accountable going forward, right? Or is this really just like big successful protests that maybe lean a bit right or don't lean liberal, right? Because again, we literally, and we're going to cover this in a story later tonight, but Ryerson University is changing its name. Why is Ryerson University changing its name? Well, during, the most peaceful summer the U.S. ever had, during the George Floyd riots, essentially Canada didn't want to be left behind in it. So, lefties, those that are of the social justice warrior variety, decided they needed some sort of cause to rally around as well. And so we saw them tearing down statues of people like, is it Egremont Ryerson? I don't remember his first name, something like that. But Ryerson, right? And there was no accountability there, right? When they tore down statues of John A. MacDonald, right? There was no accountability there. When we saw protesters wrap a Canadian flag and put, was it a hat? I forget now, on the statue of Terry Fox, we saw mainstream media lose its shit, and Liberal and NDP MPs, members of Parliament, virtue signaling to the fullest extent in that regards. And this is really, like, at the end of the day, if we want to actually, if we want to participate in a functioning society that's going to function for an extended period of time, we need laws to be equally applied to everyone. And so this idea that, we see the police so focused on, we see the administration and politicians so focused on still demonizing the Freedom Trucker Convoy protesters. And when we see Ottawa police essentially like threatening the organizers and participants of this upcoming protest, it feels a lot different than any other protest that we would normally experience here in Canada. And I can't help but notice that it seems to be along political biases. Next, from National News Watch, Convoy organizer warns a free-for-all if police ban protests from downtown Ottawa. And I think one of the big questions here is, do we believe that people should have the right to protest in front of Parliament, right? And what level of influence should the government have to dictate how someone chooses to protest, right? Particularly in the public square. Arguably, downtown Ottawa, our country's capital, would be the epicenter of town square, right? Like, it's literally where the politicians are supposed to be. Now, again, a lot of them just virtually dial in these days, so it's not like the House of Commons is always overflowing with members of Parliament, but usually at least a handful of them show up. And so this idea that essentially, potentially, every protest going forward, we're just not going to allow vehicles or demonstrators into certain areas if we find it inconvenient, I think is definitely restricting their right to the town square, right? To publicly voice their discontent. And it just, we know where this is going. Post-millennial, Ottawa Police Chief says upcoming Rolling Thunder convoy will be held accountable for unlawful actions. So if you want the post-millennials take, link the video description down below. Let's get into our first blue pill story of the day. This is from the Toronto Star. More than half of Ontario's young students say they feel depressed about the future. Feelings are driven by COVID and climate fears, reports the Ontario Student Drug Use and Health Survey of 2,200 kids in grades 7 to 12. Yeah, I honestly don't blame them. They've had fear porn pushed on them for the last 2 years, nonstop in regards to COVID-19. It appears that most of their teachers are more scared of their students and more scared of COVID than concerned about their pupils' futures, right? We see this consistently from teachers' unions, which would still love us to be forcing kids to mask, if not just enforce virtual learning indefinitely. Just another strong argument for why you need to get your kids out of the public school system. Next, from the Globe and Mail, Canada giving itself power to turn over sanctioned Russian assets to Ukraine. And I just want to kind of take a quick pot shot at this because a lot of mainstream media coverage of this is like, Canada needs to move faster in order to seize Russian property so we can give it to Ukrainians. Well, again, we've broken this down on previous episodes, and the government's made more promises since those episodes, but I'm almost positive at this point in time, since 2014, 2015, Canada's given or committed or loaned, or again, there's so many different terms and verbiage used, and it's never explicitly specified in any of the public-facing documents, but 1.5 billion, we might be up to $2 billion now that we've committed to Ukraine. If we're going to be seizing Russian assets, one, I hope that we actually create a thorough process for that, right? Because I don't like the idea of government just arbitrarily seizing assets. Reference the Freedom Trucker Convoy protesters that we were just talking about. But if we're going to go that route, shouldn't we be using that to pay ourselves back of the $2 billion that we've essentially committed to the Ukraine? Just food for thought there. Again, it's not about, like, they don't give a shit about our money, right? They only give a shit about virtue signaling on the global stage with our money. And again, that difference should matter. Next, from CBC, oil and gas will be around a lot longer than some think, despite climate change goals. RBC, energy security is a growing priority around the world after Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yeah, this idea that we're just going to legislate away all fossil fuels over the next handful of years because we want to virtue signal harder than every other country in the world isn't a good plan for a variety of reasons. And we're going to cover this in the next story, but essentially understand that the most extreme climate alarmists right now, they seem to have under their thumb, or they seem to have the ear of all major governments at this point in time, or at least all major democracies. And I think we're on the cusp of watching countries essentially commit suicide in order to out virtue signal other countries. And let's talk about Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland faces loss of 1 million sheep and cattle to meet climate change targets. Northern Ireland's Assembly's first climate act will require the farming sector to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Separate analysis by the UK government's climate advisor suggests chicken numbers would also need to be cut by 5 million by 2035. So we're talking about 500,000 cattle, 700,000 sheep, and they're looking to essentially just destroy agriculture in Northern Ireland. And you think that right now, with the conflict going on in Ukraine with Russia, this would be a reminder that, hey, countries, while global supply chains are fantastic when everything's functioning normally, it's also important to be a little self-reliant, right? Because disruptions can occur on the global supply chain stage. And I can only imagine Justin Trudeau is going to want to one-up Northern Ireland here, and maybe we'll just ban all agricultural animals. That'll show everyone else how virtuous we are as a society. Let's switch gears into a couple red pill stories now. The last one was supposed to be red pill. I just forgot. Jeff Bezos suggests Elon Musk gives China leverage over Twitter, gets wrecked in replies. Yeah, there's something just particularly ironic about Jeff Bezos trying to call out Elon Musk on anything. Now, again, this isn't to make Elon Musk our savior or anything like that, although it'd be super cool if it turns out he is. I'm just a little suspicious still. But Jeff Bezos calling out Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter and saying, does this give China undue influence over a major media outlet, right, or a media platform? And, subsequently, Jeff Bezos he literally did get owned, right? Whether you're talking about Amazon agreeing to only allow 5-star ratings of Z's book. So I'm drawing a blank now. Is it president or prime minister? President, right? Yeah, President Z. Again, talking about special treatment that Amazon's given to China. Again, if you guys want to see all the different ones, link in the video description down below to this Zero Hedge article. But I felt that was worth pointing out. The same way that, Elon Musk previously called out Bill Gates on Twitter when Bill Gates slid into his DMs and was like, hey, I'd like to talk to you about, forgetting the exact phrase he used. You guys can check Elon's tweets for the actual receipts, but essentially I want to talk to you about charity, right? Donating, philanthropy. I forget whether it was specifically about climate change or just general philanthropy, but either way, I want to talk to you about philanthropy. And Elon Musk is like, hey, are you still shorting Tesla? And he's like, yes, I am. And it's like, okay, so you're shorting the one electrical vehicle maker that seems to actually making a real dent in regards to adoption of electrical vehicles, and yet you also claim you're all about the climate. Really smells of hypocrisy there, Mr. Gates. Next from Post Millennial, Ryerson University changes name after residential school backlash. The school's name has been a topic of controversy since the cultural protests that took place across Canada and much of the West after the death of George Floyd. So I'm just curious, is there going to be consequences to these protesters? Oh, no, that's right. There isn't, because they're on the right side of the liberal narrative. I forgot, right? But like, do I really give a shit about whether a university is called Ryerson or what was it, Metro Toronto University? I forget what they actually decided. Yeah, Toronto Metropolitan University. Nah, I don't really give a shit. It's just a name. But what's important here is the active decision to try and erase history, right? There's a lot of things. There's a lot of reasons this matters, right? When you look back to Stalin's Soviet Russia or the Soviet Union, the biggest aspect there for them was controlling history, right? The same way that George Orwell explored in his book 1984, that if they control history, if they can control language, all of a sudden they can really limit and restrict what we even know, right? And with Stalin, you literally were dealing with like, people being cropped out of photos. You're dealing with people just being erased from history. And that's what we're experiencing right now. And not only is it just like the erasing of facts and history. Again, that's not to say that history is this like perfect thing that we need to hold up as like a on a pedestal, but we should be allowed to explore it and know it and understand the fact that all humans, there's no perfect human. Not even Justin Trudeau, our glorious leader. He's not even perfect, guys. I'm sorry to spoil it for you. But this idea that we now have to hold everyone accountable to today's modern standards is just asinine, right? And this erasure of history is also destroying any sense of culture, right? Any sense of belonging, any sense of understanding how we fit into the greater story that is a country, right? Like Canada. Again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We're going to see so much more cancel culture coming to schools, libraries, social media, mainstream media outlets soon near you, particularly when we look at all the anti-hate speech laws and the essentially anti-independent journalism laws that Justin Trudeau's parliament is trying to push out. Next from National Post, Bank of Canada rebukes claim Pierre Poilievre has made on inflation cryptocurrency. We don't see cryptocurrencies as a way for Canadians to opt out of inflation or as a stable source of value, Bank of Canada Deputy Governor Carolyn Rogers told the Commons Finance Committee. So why would we trust the Bank of Canada on anything, right? I'll save you guys the rant because I've done it a couple times recently on the show. But this idea that we're going to turn to these individuals that are supposed to keep inflation in check and yet have failed to do so for the last 2 years, immediately calls into question why we should be turning to them as experts in the first place. Secondly, there is nuance here in regards to the discussion of Bitcoin and whether it's protection from inflation. But one thing that we do know is Bitcoin's not designed to inflate, straight up, right? So they're looking at how Bitcoin compares to other currencies, specifically fiat currencies. Every other fiat currency is literally designed to inflate, where they look to grow the money supply, right? Make more dollars chasing the same number of goods, which inherently is designed to inflate. It's literally in the Bank of Canada's mandate to try and keep inflation between 1% and 3%. Bitcoin, there's only ever going to be 21 million. In fact, there's a lot of us that we fuck up with Bitcoin. So eventually you lose your keys, you lose access to your Bitcoin. So there's actually less than 21 really accessible Bitcoins out there. So Bitcoin is inherently deflationary, fiat currency inherently inflationary. So I don't know how they can sit here and grandstand with this sort of logic. And, they go further on to talk about how later conservative MP Ed Fast, who supports Poilievre's rival Jean Charest, asked if the witness expected cryptocurrencies to ever replace the Canadian dollar as our legal tender in Canada in the near or medium term, to which Governor Macklem essentially said no. We certainly expect the Canadian dollar will remain at the center of the Canadian financial system, he said. Of course, that's his job. That's his entire existence, the entire reason for the Bank of Canada's existence. Just because that's the way it's been doesn't mean it's the way it's going to be. So just wanted to highlight that with you guys. Next, and this, we've got a lot of black pills, if I remember correctly. This brings us into our first black pill. Top doctor says higher ups were given fake vaccine cards. So former White House COVID advisor and assistant professor at McMaster University, Dr. Paul Alexander, says several top officials, including senior doctors and CEOs, were issued fake vaccine cards after refusing mRNA vaccines. This is from Countersignal, this article here. If you guys want to go down this rabbit hole, link in the video description down below. I'm not too familiar with Dr. Paul Alexander, so, take it with a grain of salt. But if you guys want to go further down the rabbit hole, I encourage you to do so. Next from the Countersignal, digital ID coercion. Nigeria blocked 73 million phones as punishment. So Nigeria literally blocked almost 1/3 of its population cell phones because they wouldn't adopt digital ID. Just look forward to that coming to a Canada near you in the near future, because carrot or stick, they want their digital ID. Next, from the Countersignal, massive study of 23.1 million finds vaccinated have increased myocarditis risk. And man, I'm definitely getting shadow banned after this episode. But worth exploring here. Massive Nordic study finds risk of post-vaccination myopericarditis resulting in hospitalization in males 16 to 24 of 380 per million. Post-Pfizer Moderna combination, this is 28 times higher than the 13.7 million rate. So 13.7 per million rate they found post-COVID. Again, I think right now we don't have I don't think we've got an overwhelming amount of evidence here to jump to conclusions one direction or the other. But at this point in time, just medical tyranny is never justified. It doesn't matter how effective it is. If it's truly that effective, your layperson's going to adopt it, right? When they realize that their unvaccinated brother dropped dead and their vaccinated brother didn't drop dead, they're going to choose what they believe to be best for themselves. Again, it's always better to be the individual's choice rather than through coercion. But it definitely feels like we're seeing more and more evidence just slowly piling up that seems to indicate that maybe this wasn't the miracle vaccine that we were all promised. Again, I imagine most of us already realize that. Next from MSN, Tory MP calls study of link between resource development violence disgraceful. This was a weird one in my opinion. You guys tell me your thoughts on this. Ottawa, a private email shows a Conservative MP from Alberta calling an NDP-initiated study into a relationship between resource development and increased violence against Indigenous women and girls disgraceful. This really does feel like creating a study to try and justify a political position that you want to take. Can anyone even come up with like a tangential evidence or explanation for why this would be worth exploring? Or literally, should we just explore how everything impacts Indigenous women, right? And anything that even has mild passing impact, right? Or like maybe there's not even a correlation or causation there, but maybe it just looks like it. We should still jump to conclusions on it. Like it's bizarre. And again, I think that we're going to see a lot more of these wacky studies coming out to try and justify different environmental initiatives. Next from CBC News, the AgaCon is coming back to bite Justin Trudeau in the ass again. Although it seems like there's really never going to be consequences to Justin Trudeau. So this is more just like infuriating for the rest of us that have to live in a society of rules and laws that at least are applied to certainly those of us on the right. And, for the most part, to those on the left, unless they're Justin Trudeau. But Conservatives ask if Trudeau used get out of jail free card before 2016 AgaCon vacation. And so if you guys don't remember, I think this was the first ethical breach that Justin Trudeau made, right? The first ethical inquiry that was made when he was prime minister. The RCMP's decision, and this was essentially in response, or this is all about him receiving like a $200,000 free vacation, right? The RCMP's decision responded in part to a nuance in the law that makes it possible for sitting prime ministers to grant themselves consent to receive gifts that otherwise would constitute fraud against the government. So literally, if anyone else in government did this other than Justin Trudeau, there'd be no question. And, there would have to be charges and a real investigation placed. During question period on Monday, Conservative MP James Bezin asked the Liberals if Trudeau granted himself a get out of jail free card prior to the trip, which cost the government more than $215,000. Again, you might be thinking like, AgaCon, what is this? Well, I'm glad you asked. The AgaCon Foundation Canada has received nearly $330 million from the federal government since 1981. So again, this is similar to like the We Charity thing, right? Where the government gives a ton of money to this organization and then it somehow finds a way to repay Justin Trudeau. With We Charity, we saw it with his wife and his mother receiving speaker fees, right? We also saw it with the former finance minister's daughter being hired on to We Charity. And again, like we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, both in this story as well as the We Charity scandal. And so, yeah, I just like, we can't exist in a stable society where laws aren't equally applied. It just isn't going to remain stable for long, particularly when information is so easily spread, these days, regardless of how much the government tries to crack down on it. Spencer Fernando, one set of rules for us, another set of rules for the elites. And I always like Spencer's takes here, but there was a tweet here he shared in his article that really highlights and I think breaks down this for anyone that's just maybe like you're half paying attention to me right now. Was Mr. Trudeau a government official? Yes. Did Mr. Trudeau accept a benefit from the Aga Khan? Yes. Did the Aga Khan have dealings with the government? Yes. Did Mr. Trudeau have the consent in writing of the head of the branch of government for whom he worked? Unknown. If the answer was no, then did Mr. Trudeau know what he accepted was a benefit from a person who had dealings with the government? Yes. Final verdict, he'd be found guilty of fraud on the government. But because essentially he's the head of the government, he could essentially just give himself permission. Maybe this happened all the time in the past and we just didn't catch it with previous prime ministers. I wouldn't be shocked to learn that. However, I don't give a shit about the past at this moment in time. Let's start enforcing it on this prime minister and all future prime ministers. Let's create a better system, right? If Justin Trudeau really cared about trying to save face or how the public would interpret this, he would create a new system or framework here, whether voluntary or mandatory, where he would actually have to get permission from a council or his cabinet or someone else to essentially identify when these conflicts of interest could arise because he's receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars in personal benefit. Next from Blacklock's reporter, paid cash without checking. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but this is just another example of how the government just threw away money during COVID-19 with some of their crazy programs that didn't really even dig into any details, right? So high level, I think this was about $500,000 in fraud here, or arguably in fraud that occurred, which was essentially a numbered company owned by a Mississauga man. And they applied for all these rent rebates, despite the fact that they had no leases and appear to have no property they were renting. Next from the counter signal, MP Gallant sounds alarm on Bill S7, the Trudeau peeping bill. So again, the government, they believe that they're essentially entitled to all of our data, right? The same way that they believe that they're entitled essentially to make all of our medical decisions. Trudeau wants to be able to search your phone if his border agents have a reasonable general concern. According to Brenda McPhail, the director of the Privacy Technology and Surveillance Program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. This is a shockingly low and completely legal novel threshold. Yeah, so again, reasonable general concern. The fuck does that even mean? Straight up. Again, I guess not a big deal for people like us that are unvaccinated because they're never going to, allow you to travel across the border. But, someday, maybe decades from now, they might allow Canadian citizens to travel freely or semi-freely. And it'd be nice to know that the government couldn't just seize our data because they had general, reasonable concerns. Next from Zero Hedge, at World Bank Climate Talks, speaker floats idea to end conventional vehicle sales. Again, I just it boggles my mind that we find ourselves at this state where essentially these global institutions, these global committees, they seem to truly believe that we live under one world government and they have the right to dictate how every single citizen of Earth lives their lives. Just boggles my mind. Next from the Ron Paul Institute, the Ukraine war is a racket. War is a racket, wrote U.S. Major General Smedley Butler in 1935. If you guys have never looked up General Smedley, he's worth a deep dive on. Fascinating character, particularly during the Great Depression and the World War I vets protest that was at the White House. Really interesting character. And if I remember correctly, he was also approached by essentially proto-fascists in the United States, oligarchs of industry to essentially potentially overthrow the Democratic Republic in the U.S. Now, again, that's a whole different rabbit hole of conspiracies, but I'm pretty sure it's even you can find it on Wikipedia, so it's not that deep or dark of a secret. He explained, "A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of the people. Only a small inside group knows what it is about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes." General Butler's observations describes the U.S. NATO response to the Ukraine war perfectly. The propaganda continues to portray the war in Ukraine as that of an unprovoked Goliath out to decimate an innocent David, unless we in the US and NATO contribute massive amounts of military equipment to Ukraine to defeat Russia. As is always the case with propaganda, this version of events is manipulated to bring an emotional response to the benefit of special interests. Yeah, if there, like, straight up, if there was no money to be made in the war in Ukraine, I can guarantee you there wouldn't be a war in Ukraine. And certainly we wouldn't be throwing money at Ukraine, right? If special interest groups, if the industrial military complex didn't stand to profit from all this warmongering, the war would have been over a long time ago. University of Waterloo says only women, transgender, non-binary, or two-spirit individuals qualify for tenured board position. While the posting does not state outright why the university will only consider those who identify as such genders, the posting does ensure that both a land acknowledgement and a diversity statement are included. This is so fucking gross. Just fucking gross. I just want to give you guys a highlight. Yesterday's special episode where we're doing a deep dive on David Fishman's mathematical modeling. Someone pulled together a collage of all the craziness that was the headlines. So we've got the Ottawa Citizen, and I think this is important to highlight because, again, this is one mathematical model that we already explored as a layman, admittedly as a layman, explored it and called into question at least some of the assumptions made in that model, or certainly why we should take that model seriously based upon the assumptions. And if you guys didn't watch it, go watch yesterday's video. But mixing with unvaccinated increases COVID-19 risk for vaccinated people, study finds from the Ottawa Citizen. Globe and Mail, unvaccinated disproportionately risk safety of those unvaccinated or those vaccinated against COVID-19, study shows. CTV News, being with unvaccinated people increases COVID-19 risk for those who are vaccinated, study finds. Mixing with City News here, mixing with unvaccinated increases COVID-19 risk for vaccinated, study. Again, if you were to just read these headlines, you would justifiably jump to the conclusion that they must have looked at the last 2 years of data and figured this out. Nope, they put together a really flimsy, very basic mathematical model that made some huge assumptions and arguably started off with the conclusion first, built the model to justify their conclusion, and then pushed this out across all of mainstream media. Ridiculous. Next from Blacklock's reporter, made $20K on French claims. A retired federal IT consultant has won $19,900, and this is our clown pill story of the day. In federal court costs and damages after successfully searching the internet for technical breaches of bilingualism regulations, a judge upheld one complaint against the St. John's Airport Authority for wishing travelers a happy St. Patrick's Day in English only. This is a quote from the douchebag that started it, the lawsuit. "The older I get, the more I realize federal institutions continue to violate my rights," said Michael Thidobola, purposely mispronouncing because I don't give a shit, of Ottawa. "The more I realize that one day I will die and still they will not respect my rights." This idea that we want language police in this country, I think I'm done with Canada, guys. I'm sorry. I'm getting close to tapping out. CBC News, this Ottawa store is selling magic mushrooms to protest unjust laws. I like it. I'm down for this. I think there's probably going to be consequences eventually, although maybe not, because this is kind of a fuzzy place, right? But I think personally, magic mushrooms, when taken in the right mental state with the right environment, can definitely be productive or conducive to self exploration and understanding of oneself. So again, not going to recommend individuals do it, but I recommend individuals learning more about what it's all about rather than just being scared of it, because I definitely was for the first probably the first couple decades of my life. Next from the counter signal, breaking Denmark ends COVID vaccine programs. So just nice to see another country moving on from COVID hysteria. And then Tim Pool actually took out a giant Times Square billboard and blasted Washington Post and Taylor Lorenz over Libs of TikTok hit piece where they doxed the Libs of TikTok and shared her personal home address. And then they literally had the balls to just delete the fact that they doxed her and denied it. And yet, again, like Tim Pool's documented this, Louder with Crowder. A lot of people have documented it. They just don't care. Straight up. It's just bizarre when people are like, just 1984 should have like, no, we didn't. No, like I took a screenshot. Here it is. No, wasn't us. But that's where we are as a society these days. And then finally, our meme of the day. And honestly, I think this meme I could just reuse for just about everything. But don't make me tap the sign. It's not rocket science, guys. They're just evil and want to diddle kids. And this is in response to a video clip that Steven Crowder shared where this individual is talking about POCD, which is like, I forget the exact term. I won't ruin you and spread the evil here, but essentially it's like pedophile obsessive compulsive disorder. And it's about just constantly having the urge to abuse children and trying to normalize it and destigmatize it. Yeah, this is that's the society we find ourselves in. Wild times. Anyways, kind of feel like this episode was just a little all over the place. There's almost just too much news to cover today, and too much of it was just too stupid for me. But if you guys enjoyed it, smash the like button, hit subscribe if you're new to the channel. Appreciate those of you that share this on social media, because I think I've said just about every bad word on social media that can get you shadow banned in this episode alone. Maybe we didn't talk about LGBTQ alphabet soup. There. I think now I've used every trigger word just about that can get me banned from YouTube. But yeah, that's it for tonight's episode. If you guys want more Matt McKeever in your life, check me out on Instagram, Matt McKeever Unfiltered on IG. Mainly me just resharing shit posts and memes and occasionally hot takes. But I really do appreciate you guys sharing with me your hot takes, making this a two-way conversation, jumping in that comment section. So Kohana was kind of blowing up the chat at the start here, and yep, I'm fine with that, guys. The more engagement, the better. The algorithm only respects engagement. But essentially just talking about the trucker convoy was the largest uprising Canada has seen that was grassroots, not funded by the government, because they wanted bodily autonomy, which is a God-given right, and Trudeau wanted to take their rights away. Not going to disagree with you there, Kohana. And I think what's fascinating is every article I read in mainstream media keeps still to this day referring to it as an occupation right, as white nationalists, as people wanting to overthrow the democracy of Canada. It's just like, bro, I don't know what filters you're using when you watch those videos, or what clown world interpretation of reality you're using, but like that's not what I saw on social media, right? Again, reminder that arson wasn't actually done by any of the Freedom Trucker Convoy protesters, right? Remember, the loaded shotguns that Justin Ling claimed, they didn't actually exist. And we covered it in a previous episode, but Justin Ling actually was the same reporter that, really tried to go to bat for the RCMP when they had that unfortunate incident of police essentially like chatting and playing up the fact that how much fun it was to, abuse protesters. I don't know how else to really frame that. So yeah, I really don't think that they're serious with this inquiry. And honestly, like, why even bother if you're not going to take it serious, right? I would love to see them take it seriously and try and actually mend the divide that Justin Trudeau created in Canada over the last 2 years. The polarization, the politics infecting every aspect of life today in Canada, that's a Justin Trudeau thing, right? That's something that he created through his chosen rhetoric to demonize anyone that disagrees with him, right? The immediate jump to conclusions of calling everyone a racist, a misogynist. Honestly, if it wasn't for the Freedom Trucker Convoy protest, I probably wouldn't have got good at pronouncing misogynist. But it was in every goddamn article, And so I eventually had to learn how to pronounce it right, because my brain just doesn't interpret words good, especially when I'm like reading in public. But that's because of you, Justin Trudeau, that I can now pronounce misogynist when I'm reading it out loud for the class. P58 says, just in case I pulled some cash from the bank myself at the time. Yeah, I don't think you were alone. At first, I honestly thought it was hyperbole when people were saying there was a bank run in Canada in regards to Canadians pulling out money. I did it because I was like, yeah, I don't give a shit whether it's hyperbole or not. I want a cushion. But the more people I've talked to over an extended period of time, turns out there's a lot more of us out there that was like, fuck it. I don't even know if they're going to freeze my account. I don't give a shit. I just want my money out of it. And honestly, this is just everything that happened in Canada this winter, winter is when it happened, has really just expedited my personal timeline of like personal hyper Bitcoinization, right? I'm trying to figure out ways to use Bitcoin almost exclusively in my life because I just don't want to participate in the evil that is fiat currency anymore. And thankfully, I'm in a beneficial or privileged enough position to be able to do that. Farzana's in the chat. What's up? Kohana says, being far right for the Liberals is anyone that loves freedom, less centralized government, less taxes, and anyone that is patriotic, trying to preserve their culture. Yeah, remember when they were demonizing the Canadian flag during the protests, right? And they were talking about people being triggered and scared of the Canadian flag. Terry says, it's clear that the Liberals are terrified of the public. They are trying really hard to silence and censor people. Even now with Rolling Thunder, they legally have to walk in to protest. No rolling. Yes. What's up, Dirty Burger? And I agree. Like with all the demonization we're seeing in mainstream media around populism, right, and populist movements, really tells you that like they were never about the people, the NDP or the Liberals. It was only a means for them to accrue power and be able to implement policies that they want to see implemented. They don't actually give a shit about the average person. If they did, rather than doing everything they can to continue to stick to the mandates, to continue to enforce masks, to enforce these vaccine passports, to lock down their own citizens in their own country if they're unvaccinated, they would be doing the exact opposite. You would be looking for any and all justifications to open back up, right? The moment the U.S. did it, you would be like looking over on their notes and trying to crib and figure out how quickly can I implement this in my own country. But they don't actually give a shit. It's unfortunate. Dirty Burger, that Ottawa police chief is the weirdest person. Yes, the intern police chief. And it's so funny because like you would think woke culture, previously they had a black police chief in Ottawa, right? But they fired him because he supported white nationalists that were protesting and down, and he didn't really support them. He just wasn't a douche to them. But essentially like made him resign, got an intern police chief that's a white dude now. And in like woke logic, somehow that's okay because this police chief just says whatever Trudeau and the mayor of Ottawa wants to hear. Rises Above says, haven't caught Maple Pill in a week or two. Need that full course of pills. Glad you jumped in. Dirty Berg, nerve damage more than okay. I think I jumped in mid-conversation. Jeff Bezos with the CIA money should shut the hell up. I agree with you there, Kohana. Be suspicious of any powers they got there somehow and always have a motive. 100% agree, Terry. And honestly, like, you know, really take a step back. Like, who would want to rule over their fellow man, right? Only people that don't think that they can accomplish shit themselves, in my opinion, right? Only the parasite class wants to rule over their fellow man. Everyone else is like, no, I'm just going to go build my own shit. I'm just going to have my own life. I'm just going to do good things. And these people are like, no, I must aggregate power. I must strip individuals of their freedoms so that I can build the future that I desire for these people to exist within. We've got Benjamin in the chat. I'm late, just butchered 2 sheep. That's awesome, Benjamin. If you joined late, you might want to check out Northern Ireland because they're going to have to, get rid of, 700,000 sheep over the coming years in order to meet their environmental targets. We've got Al in the chat. Sup, y'all? Better late than never. Sorry. I'm glad to see you here. And appreciate everyone that's smashing the like button and subscribe, all that good stuff. Dirty Burger, Liberals can suck my front hole. That's a deep ref. But sadly, those of us that watch every episode of the Maple Pill, we understand what front hole means. B58, I've been asked to move the Canadian flag from driven by, you had a Canadian flag on your company vehicle and they asked you to remove it? That's fucking ridiculous. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure who was bad-mouthing building codes, but I'm on board with it as well. Yeah, totally. Even building codes line the industry's pockets. 100%. And again, what's fascinating is right now with Ron DeSantis in Florida, right? And the decision to essentially restrict the or like remove the special privileges of Disney. One of the big privileges Disney had was like they essentially were able to treat themselves like an individual sovereignty. And so they didn't have to conform to building standards, right? They didn't have to conform to building permits. They could just do whatever they wanted. And while, you know, no individual country should be given that a special privilege, every single one of us should actually just have that as a right to do with our property as we see fit. And yeah, there would be risks involved, but it turns out life has always been a little bit risky. And it's the trade-offs, right? The risk reward that has allowed us to, you know, excel as a society. The only reason we're here today is because of free trade, individualism, individual sovereignty, right? It's the freedoms and rights that people finally got at the turn of the 20th century and into the 20th century that really allowed us to reap all the benefits, right? Technology progressed at an unprecedented rate because of the freedom that more and more people were granted. And somehow we built not a perfect, but a wonderful society, better than anything else that we've experienced as humans. And now our decision is to essentially stop doing all the things that got us here, right? It's like the person that finally made it to, you know, whatever, the NHL. And the way they got to the NHL was practicing, working hard, you know, holding themselves personally accountable for a decade. And then they make it to the NHL and they decide, you know what? Beer and pizza. I'm going to stop going to practice. And all I'm going to give a shit about is like Instagram and, you know, whatever, you know, club life and all that jazz, you know. And it's like, yeah, that's not going to, your career is not going to end well if you take that decision branch. And unfortunately, as a society, we seem to be following in a similar set of footsteps where, I don't know, society just seems obsessed with killing itself these days. It feels like, literally feels like we're just trying to inflict our own societal suicide, which I can't help but think that Rome probably experienced something similar. But anyways, enough of me rambling. Appreciate you guys hanging out with me. Smash some like buttons, all that stuff. And we'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And yeah, thanks, guys.
Asking blue pill, red pill, corporate press, I've had my fill. I'm just a simple chap, believing in my own will. Web fire, math, table scheming, this is no drill. Haters masking boosted, but still with no chill. Need to come and take